collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, we'll talk to the Israeli Foreign Ministry about the ongoing slaughter in Gaza.
It's almost a sense of deja vu, where we begin to wonder whether the United Nations Human Rights Council is still being run by Muammar Gaddafi. Of course, we know he's dead, so that can't be the case.
We'll hear about growing support for the Jewish Voice for Peace and their campaign to end the Gaza occupation.
The Israeli parliament has talked about putting Gazans on a diet. They control how many calories, how much water, how much electricity people in Gaza get every day.
And in local news, Cyprus' former finance minister discusses the resolution of the Federal Bank of the Middle East.
This is a case of the Americans who are extremely sensitive about financing terrorist activities, and they have some indications that something like that may have been going on. Nothing has been proven.
The death toll in Gaza continues to rise, with no sign of a let-up in hostilities. Paul Hershen is a spokesman for the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Paul, thanks for joining us on the Cyprus News Digest. Can you tell us when this bombardment is going to stop?
This is an excellent question, and really the people who can answer that are the leadership of Hamas, because the reason that we're in this conflict is that they insisted on dragging us in against our will, and now that we're there, we're left with no choice but to pursue both arms of the military strategic layout of Hamas, the rockets and the terror tunnels. We didn't want to be here in the first place. I think everybody knows that. And we accepted the 3 ceasefire proposals and implemented them, all of which were ignored by Hamas. So we're in a very, very difficult situation. One we didn't want to be in, but there is an obligation that every country has to its public, and that is to protect them and to ensure security.
And how does the blockade in Gaza ensure security in the area?
Well, to be fair, of course, there is no blockade. What there is a naval blockade. The naval blockade was put in place quite a while ago, a few years ago, was ruled legal and legitimate by the United Nations, and it was put there precisely because we find ourselves in a situation where the Gaza Strip is ruled by a murderous, monstrous organization who puts at the very focus of its activities the desire and the attempt, and in too many cases the success of murdering any Israeli or Jew that they can get their hands on. It was put in place in order to prevent the importing of weaponry, but of course it was ruled legal and legitimate by the United Nations. In terms of the
Sorry,
land,
hang on a minute, Paul. When you say it was ruled legal, you're talking now about the nautical limit. But that was originally set at 20 nautical miles and then over time reduced. And I think that at the end of the last Gaza war, it was down to 3 nautical miles. That doesn't allow a great deal of hope for the fishermen, and I think there are over 3,000 of them in the area.
This is a very difficult situation. I agree with you, and this is precisely what the people of Gaza have to suffer at the hands of one of the darkest political regimes in modern history. Look, let's make no mistake, Hamas, these guys are cut of the same cloth as ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or Boko Haram down in Nigeria stealing girls. God help us, I don't know what they're doing to them. And these are the people that the people of Gaza are living under. Nobody thinks for a moment that this is an easy life for them.
Why was it that the Israeli government, as I understood it, it was being blamed in Israel because it failed to prevent the international community from recognising the unity deal between Hamas and Fatah? Now, if you were dealing with a single unity government, then surely it would be possible to come to some arrangement. But it seems that since you didn't recognise that unity deal, this latest escalation has actually been a godsend for Netanyahu's government, hasn't it?
No, it's been a disaster. It's been an absolute disaster for everybody. First and foremost for the Palestinians. Look, there is a difference between a unity government, a Palestinian unity government for peace, and a Palestinian unity government for murder. The international community has said, the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, others have said Egypt as well, have said very clearly, Hamas is a terrorist organization. If they recognize Israel, if they renounce violence, and if they accept prior agreements legally binding both on Israel and on the Palestinians, then it's a whole different ballgame.
And does that mean that then this blockade would be lifted? Because basically you're starving these people out, aren't you?
No, not at all. Look, the blockade is a naval blockade exclusively.
Well, it's not a naval blockade. They can't get across the crossings, Paul. They can't get out of Gaza, and Israel keeps saying, you must leave, but it doesn't actually tell them how they're going to leave and where they're going to go.
No, that's not true. There are two separate issues here. First of all, with the exception of the past 2 weeks, of course, where there's been fighting and things have been a difference. But before that, there was zero limitation on exports. Zero limitation on exports. There were very limited limitations on imports, and as it turns out, we've seen exactly what they've done with their imports, which is take it all and pour it underground at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, at the expense of the welfare of their own people, in building terror tunnels. And don't forget, of course, that they share a border with Egypt. Israel doesn't actually have the physical ability to put a blockade on, because they are welcome whether we like it or not. In many cases we don't.
No, but you've built a wall, haven't you?
Or weapons.
You've built a wall to keep them in and stop them getting out into Israel.
Well, no, you're talking about a small part of the security barrier between Israel and the West Bank. We're talking about the Gaza Strip, where there's no wall, there is a fence, but it's our international frontier. I don't know what we're supposed to do other than build 30 years ago, I think it was, it was less than that, to be fair, a security barrier between ourselves and the other side of our sovereign territory. The idea that the Palestinians, or at least the murderers from Hamas, should be free to cross at will into Israel doesn't hold water. I mean,
Paul, sorry, let me interrupt again for a moment, because actually the bottom line here seems to be that when you kettle a group of people, and in this case a nation, into a small area, and you deny them control over their water supply and their electricity. When today the humanitarian agencies of the UN, I think, said that the food and water was now running out. This, forgive me, sounds very much like the Warsaw Ghetto in World War II. Now, during that, the Jews used tunnels and the sewer system to smuggle in vital supplies and to attack their oppressors. It now seems to many people that with the boot on the other Palestinian foot, you're suggesting that this is unacceptable behaviour. Isn't that hypocrisy?
If I may, the analogy is a little disgraceful. But you yourself point out that in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews used tunnels to smuggle in food, whereas over here, what Hamas is doing is smuggling weapons in the opposite direction across an international frontier in order to murder children. So just to put things in perspective...
Sorry, who's murdering children, Paul, at the moment? The death toll in the last 2 weeks is how many Palestinian children?
Way too many, and the responsibility for that lies directly at the doorstep of Hamas.
They didn't fire the bullets or shoot the guns, did they?
We will probably discover, as we usually do, that a significant amount of those bullets were fired exactly by Hamas. Yes, you know very well that they're using human shields. They are behaving in a cynical fashion. They're using child soldiers, which in itself is a war crime. And as usually happens, numbers are thrown around in a rather distasteful way, which as time goes by get adjusted and a real picture comes out. We already know that something approaching 250 of the dead are confirmed Hamas terrorists, and to be fair, also Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We know
so that's
from
about a
the
third of the
website
dead, which ties up with the UN figures, which say at the moment that 74% of those killed in Gaza are civilians, and that medical clinics are among the facilities hit by airstrikes. In fact, if I'm correct, I think Navi Pillay has said that there is possibly an investigation to be done into war crimes.
Oh, I would recommend to Navi Pillay to tread carefully. I think that she and the Human Rights Council risk embarrassing themselves even more than they did last time when the Goldstone report came out, and Judge Goldstone was eventually forced to turn around and apologize in embarrassment and say that the entire investigation was a farce. It's almost a sense of deja vu where we begin to wonder whether the United Nations Human Rights Council is still being run by Muammar Gaddafi. Of course, we know he's dead, so that can't be the case. But it seems to be that at the moment. I suggest that we address this trade in blood, this game of numbers, with a little bit of hesitation before we pronounce. Experience shows us that as time goes by, when real numbers come out, we start to understand a far different picture to that one which you just presented.
Okay, let me ask you this, Paul, if I may. Israel does say that it is trying to prevent civilian casualties by giving warnings to people to leave. Do you seriously now think that a 1-minute warning by text message or a warning bomb on somebody's roof immediately prior to a strike actually absolves Israel of responsibility in the deaths that ensue?
Well, let me ask you, do you honestly believe that that's the case? I mean, really?
Well, we've seen it. We've watched film footage from international news agencies of the bomb on the roof followed within less than a minute by a strike. In fact, one nearly hit a UN water lorry.
Absolutely. Look, that is absolutely not the case, and you're fully aware of that. For 3 days, we begged the residents of Shajaiya to move out. We told them which areas they should go to, which would not be dangerous areas. We leafleted the place for 3 days. We phoned hundreds of thousands of phone calls, of text messages for 3 days. There was not a media channel in the world which did not report that Israel was warning this neighborhood and the other neighborhood. Everybody knew. The idea that you just presented, that there's a 30-second or a 1-minute warning in between one thing and another, is patently untrue and verges on laughable. It's simply not the case. The fact that the vast majority of the residents are paying attention to the warnings that we get, that they are getting, despite both warnings and instructions from Hamas to ignore the warnings that they are being received, is clear evidence of the fact that Israel and the Israeli military has taken unprecedented steps, has probably set a new standard for militaries around the world as to what to do under very difficult circumstances. Let's not pretend that these are easy circumstances. Hamas is hiding behind its deliberately its own civilians.
And is that why you're using flechette weapons and bombs as well? Because those would be certain, wouldn't they, to kill the civilians behind whom Hamas, you say, is hiding, rather than the people behind the human shield?
I cannot speak to operational considerations, but I can tell you this. The Israeli military works 100% within the dictates of international humanitarian law. We welcome you to come and to check and to understand the reality of the situation, and I guarantee that you will come to that conclusion.
All right. Mahmoud Abbas has said that agreement can be reached if there's an opening of the border crossings, and he said ending all forms of aggressions. That presumably means an end to the rocket attacks. Is Israel, which has obviously got the upper hand here, going to insist that the rocket attacks stop first before it will give some semblance of dignity to the people of Palestine?
Well, some semblance of dignity to the people of Palestine. We redeployed out of the Gaza Strip 9 years ago in the hope that they would build a Dubai on the Mediterranean, and instead what they've been doing is shooting themselves in the foot repetitively for some years now. When you talk about the opening of the borders, I believe that what Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas even more so in particular are talking about are the border crossings between Gaza and Egypt that we have no control over. It's not our decision. This is a very difficult scenario.
You work very closely with Egypt. They wouldn't agree to it unless you probably told them that it was okay.
I think that's a little bit misleading to imagine for a second that the sovereign country of Egypt just is waiting for instructions from us. That isn't quite exactly.
I don't think that's what I said, but you do work very closely with Egypt on all these issues, and you have said, I believe, that you want them to be involved in any ceasefire negotiations.
I think that we have to remember that as far as the Egyptians are concerned, Hamas is a terrorist organization, that Hamas just a few months ago murdered 20 or 30 Egyptian police officers and soldiers. I think that, Egypt has its own decision-making process and its own feelings and thoughts vis-a-vis the people in Hamas. I don't think that it has that much to do with our relationship with Egypt. They have their own very poor relationship with Hamas, all because of the way Hamas behaves. It's not only the Palestinians that Hamas is abusing, and it's not only the Israelis that Hamas is trying to murder. They have an agenda which is bigger than that.
All right, and finally, the airlines, Paul. There have been several EU and US airlines that have stopped landing in Tel Aviv, and I believe that President Netanyahu has asked John Kerry to lift the ban. Now, this happens just days after the Malaysian plane was shot down over Ukraine, which called into question the advisability of exposing passengers to potential risks in conflict zones. How can Israel guarantee the safety of airlines if they do fly to Tel Aviv?
Well, it is a fantastic question. First of all, I don't think there's been anybody in Israel who hasn't asked themselves the rhetorical question, what on earth would happen were Hamas to get their hands on surface-to-air missiles? And it's precisely the reason why we have said the Gaza Strip needs to be demilitarized, and why just the day before yesterday, all 28 members of the European Union collectively put out an official statement saying that the European Union and all 28 of its members insist that Hamas be disarmed. But just to speak to the specifics, of course, you probably know that the Federal Aviation Authority today rescinded the restriction on flights to Israel. Flights are starting again. Everybody's back. Business is open for as usual. There is a 100% cast iron guarantee of the security of planes coming into and out of Israel. The Federal Aviation Authority would never have rescinded the ban had they thought anything else.
All right, Paul Hershen, thank you very much indeed for your time and for joining me on the programme.
Thank you, my pleasure, anytime.
That was Paul Hershen, spokesman from the Israeli Foreign Ministry.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Jewish Voice for Peace is an organisation that is now global, and they have a very different take on the whole situation in the Gaza Strip and Palestine than the Israelis do. Naomi Dan is from Jewish Voice for Peace, and she joins us now. Naomi, thanks very much indeed for coming on the Cyprus News Digest. Do tell us first, if you will, a little bit about the organisation.
Hi, Rosie. Thank you so much for having me. Jewish Voice for Peace is a United States-based organization of mostly American Jews. We have partners on the ground in Israel, in West Bank, and in Gaza. We have over 140,000 subscribers. That was actually before the most recent escalation of violence in the region, and we've been growing significantly in the last few weeks as more and more people are waking up to the fact that what's going on in that region is appalling and unjustifiable.
Have you got any thoughts on why it seems to be that every 3 or 4 years the same thing happens over and over again? It's like déjà vu.
Well, there's actually a term for it within the Israeli military security establishment. They call it mowing the grass, and the idea is that they're beating back Hamas's capabilities and the capabilities for resistance and kind of quelling any civilian hope and empowerment every couple of years to kind of maintain the status quo.
Now, am I right in thinking, I know that the accepted thinking is that this time it all started with the kidnap of those poor young Israeli teenagers and their subsequent murder. But I had read somewhere that in actual fact a couple of weeks before that happened, a couple of Palestinian youths were killed by Israelis, and that's what started off the rocket fire. Can you confirm or deny that?
So you're right in saying that the mainstream news has been covering this as if it was just Hamas that started firing rockets and Israel's responding defensively, and you're right that that's not the case at all. On May 15th, which Palestinians celebrate as Nakba Day, the day that many, I think 750,000 were expelled from their homes in 1948, there was a demonstration and 2 young Palestinian teenagers were killed. And it was captured on CNN cameras. And so there was a lot of upset and anger within the Palestinian community at that time. But actually, I would say that the current escalation dates back to April, when the Palestinian unity government between Fatah and Hamas was created. And since then, the Israeli government has been doing what they can to break up that possibility of a unitary government and a unified Palestinian state. And so there have been attacks on Gaza, airstrikes periodically. When we see it reported as calm and quiet in the mainstream media, it's not necessarily calm and quiet, and usually that means it's calm for Israelis, and there isn't violence on Israel, but there have been periodic strikes on Gaza throughout all of this time that we've seen it quiet in the media.
What you say suggests that you believe that the Israeli government doesn't want any solution to this problem whatsoever. If the chances of Hamas and Fatah getting together and coming to some agreement whereby a solution could be reached, then surely that would be win-win all round, wouldn't it?
Well, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the Israeli government's plan. As we saw 2 weeks ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, he was very forthright about the fact that he could not imagine the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state, that the possibility of a two-state solution was non-existent, that Israel would never give up its control over the West Bank for fear of having another Gaza. And as we know, while the Israeli government claims that they ended the occupation and withdrew from Gaza in 2005, they still have control over the air, the water, the imports and the exports, the border crossings, and effectively and under international law, people in Gaza have still been under that occupation throughout that time.
They're under siege, aren't they, Naomi, basically?
Yes, under siege, under a blockade. The embargo controls what can get in and out, who can get in and out. The Israeli parliament has talked about putting Gazans on a diet. They control how many calories, how much water, how much electricity people in Gaza get every day.
That sounds horrifyingly like the Nazis and their 185 calories a day, was it, that they allowed the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto?
That is a comparison that some people have made, and most people are talking about Gaza with the term an open-air prison, and the conditions there are really terrible.
So the Jewish Voice for Peace, you said at the beginning it's a mixed bag of people now from all over the world. And you've been very active demonstrating not just against what's going on in Gaza, but I think you have a campaign hoping that people across the world will join it, that will, in a sense, punish businesses that do business with Israel until this persecution, one might say, of the Palestinians is stopped.
Jewish Voice for Peace does support the Palestinian-led call for an economic, cultural, and academic boycott of institutions in Israel. So that is a global campaign that stems from a call from Palestinian society. And we support that. We support their nonviolent methods of resistance.
And is it having any effect?
Well, within the last year, the conversation about BDS has had a huge uptick. Israeli leaders are talking about it. There's definitely some fear that it has gained huge momentum, especially within the last year. And so I think that it is causing some fear within Israeli leadership. And And I do think that we're moving towards more economic pressure, especially even in the last few weeks, pressuring Israel internationally to abide by international law. And the BDS campaign is part of that pressure.
Naomi Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And you can find out more at www.bdsmovement.net and, of course, at jewishvoiceforpeace.org.
Online and as a podcast, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
And now some good news if you're an expat living in Cyprus. Do you want an easier way of making contact with friends and family back home? Well, if you're tired of trying to arrange Skype dates with loved ones only to be frustrated by poor quality and delayed and awkward conversations, then the Cyprus News Digest has the answer. We've teamed up with the Expat Phone Company to offer you a 1-month free trial of the EPphone service. You'll get a real physical telephone for free that simply plugs into the back of your internet connection. Once it's plugged in, it's connected with your own personal UK phone number with a UK area code of your choice. Friends, family and colleagues in the UK can call you on this number without paying international call charges. With EPphone, you get professional business-grade call quality without any hidden charges. You can also make phone calls with your EPphone. Just dial any number in any country and your call will be charged at the local rate of that country, saving you the huge international calling rates charged by your current phone provider. You can sign up for this trial at www.epphone.com. That's EPFONE.com. You simply enter the promotion code CND in the relevant box to waive the first month's low service charge. This is the Cyprus News Digest, making your life easier and cheaper with EPphone. Check www.epphone.com.
Get in touch with the Cyprus News Digest by emailing cyprusnewsdigest@gmail.com.
Big news this week was that the Central Bank of Cyprus announced late on Monday that it was placing the Federal Bank of the Middle East, which has been rocked by money laundering allegations, under resolution. What does that mean? It's a great pleasure to talk once again to our former Finance Minister, Michalis Saris. Michalis, what does placing a bank under resolution actually mean?
It actually means that the central bank takes over the activities of the bank, and it is basically making all the decisions regarding the bank. This is a power given to central banks throughout Europe. It is actually connected with the ongoing financial crisis. This is relatively modern legislation because many banks, unrelated to money laundering for a number of reasons that you know, the fact that they had huge non-performing loans, that they had made bad investments, they got into difficulty, and then the central banks are the first line of defense. And the objective, of course, is for the bank to continue to be run normally so that depositors feel that there is no threat to their deposits until, of course, and the objective is either to close the bank if the bank cannot survive, or to sell it. Those are really the objectives of putting it under resolution.
Which will worry depositors no end, surely. When do we know, first of all, whether or not these allegations have any grain of truth in them? Because we all recall that it was money laundering allegations a few years ago, many of which were not proven, that actually undermined the entire banking system in Cyprus. Absolutely,
and really this is the great now discomfort and risk that we are running, that there is a revival of that in this context of those allegations, which are, as you say, were not proven. This is a case of the Americans who are extremely sensitive about financing terrorist activities, and they have some indications that something like that may have been going on. Nothing has been proven. In fact, this bank, anticipating some of these difficulties, has had a couple of separate agencies look into their procedures. In fact, they were prudent enough to ask a German group, Germany being the country that had voiced the more vocal suspicions and accusations about Cyprus. And from what I hear, their procedures were adequate. Now, it is very difficult to check every transaction. You can say, I have the procedures, but there are thousands of transactions, and it is possible that some have fallen between the cracks. And I think if one or two cases were connected with financing some of these people that could be considered as being close to some terrorist activities, it has raised this anger and very public display by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the United States, which is a very active agency trying to look throughout the world. But as you say, nothing has been proven. But our central bank, sensitive about all these accusations, they thought that the more sensible thing to do is to put the bar very high, to say, look, when we hear things like that, we will go in, we will check for ourselves. And apparently the decision they have taken is to try and sell this bank. I want to underline that they have deposits. I think they are just under 2 billion. We are not talking about an enormous amount. All of it is by foreigners, and foreigners not living in Cyprus. We are not talking about a bank that has taken a lot of local deposits from people in Cyprus, whether they are Cypriots or people who have chosen to live here. So
it's basically an offshore bank.
It's basically an offshore bank. It was really what I would call, from the point of view of Cyprus, a bit like a post office bank, meaning that money would come in from their clients. Some of it will be deposited, but much of it, the bulk of it, was to make payments and investments in different parts of the world.
But the bottom line in banking is trust. And when you come out with accusations, substantiated or not, that trust is greatly undermined. Now, where are the depositors in the FBME standing right now? Because if this does undermine the bank to the extent that it went bankrupt, then actually it's the government that would have to bail out the depositors, isn't it?
Right. Now, this is an interesting case. This is a bank that has extremely favorable indicators, meaning that this capital, its reserves, cover many times over its deposits. This is, in that sense, is not a typical bank. This is not a bank that went out and loaned out its deposits so that because the difficulty of confidence is, by definition, a bank, even when it is formed, is insolvent. Why? Because it takes people's deposits that they have. They have to give it back to them within an hour after they ask for it, but they lend the money out to people that may take 5 or 10 years to repay. So if you are in a crisis of confidence, you have a problem there. You have to go out and sell the loans that you made in order to pay your depositors. In this case, this bank has more than adequate reserves to pay out the deposits on demand. It is interesting because I checked this, that in the few days that have elapsed since this, because it is true this was done Monday night, but it had already started from the weekend that it hit the press in New York. There was no significant outflow of deposits. In other words, people did not panic to say, look, what is going on here? Is this a bank that is going to go under? Because this is the nature of the investors there. They know the fundamentals of this bank, and I don't think there is any risk there.
It's one bank in a whole sort of conglomerate. I think they're based in Tanzania, aren't they?
Yes.
Why particularly the Cyprus Bank? That's another thing people are asking. I mean, presumably that if they have the correct protocols in place, they are across the board.
Yes. No, this is a bank that, as you say, is based in Tanzania. They really don't have that many branches. And although they are based on Tanzania, the bulk of their activities, more than 90%, are transacted through Cyprus. They have wanted to, over the years, to have a more, perhaps to transform their branch status into a normal bank license, but for a number of reasons they didn't feel they were ready to do that. Incidentally, they have been here in Cyprus since 1982. This is a bank that goes back many years. And there is evidence that they wanted to stay for a long time. Why do I say that? Because they leased a huge plot of land, and they built a very impressive building near the Kikos monastery in Nicosia. And there will be an interesting question now. Will the buyer be interested in that? In other words, there were some things that need to be resolved. But this is a bank that is based in Tanzania. That's where their license is. It has some peculiarities it is that, in the sense that it is owned basically by two brothers. There is nothing wrong with that. In fact, there are trade-offs. One can say decisions can be taken more easily. On the other hand, central banks prefer dispersion. They like a bank that has a wide spectrum of owners, and they would like the ownership to be separated from the day-to-day management, which was not the case in this particular case. It's a very traditional boutique bank of the old style, where it is my bank, the family felt. Again, there is nothing wrong necessarily with that, but these are the kinds of things that come into play when things like that happen.
So what do we expect now from the central bank with regard to this? You say they want to sell it. Can they just come in and say, suppose it was yours and my bank, Michalis? Why can the central bank come in and say, sorry guys, we're going to sell it?
Yeah, well, they have to, of course, show proper cause. I do not know what is the nature of the allegations, what is the degree of the confidence that they have to put into it. But I think it is a combination of two things. They must have seen things that they thought abounded to something like a prima facie case. They also, because we are now talking about the reputation of Cyprus, we are in the middle of trying to raise crucial capital for the Bank of Cyprus. We cannot be seen to be whistling in the air when somebody says something is happening in your country of this nature. So there is a possibility of an overreaction in the context of trying to send the message that when things become to our attention, we are going to deal with them. But I do not know the facts. There are three very able people in the central bank that are the resolution authority. I'm sure they looked into this and they have collectively taken the decision that this was the best course of action.
Former Cyprus Finance Minister Michalis Saris. And a couple of other stories making the headlines this week. Post offices have been overwhelmed with applications for the GMI, the Guaranteed Minimum Income. The Electricity Authority, the EAC, has said that it will help people repay overdue bills by instalments. And the controversial bill on football violence has passed through the House of Representatives, although it has been described by some as toothless. And the policing cost has been passed back to the state, even though the expenses were several years ago supposed to be covered by the football clubs themselves. The Cyprus Football Association had agreed back in 2010 that half the cost of policing matches would be covered by the teams, but they failed to honour that agreement. And according to Odysseos Michailidis, who is the Auditor General, the CFA came up with only €78,000. And American investors are apparently interested in leasing and operating the iconic Lydra Palace Hotel in the buffer zone in Nicosia. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.